Hey guys, Modelling Weekly here. Well, for today's video I'll be painting up my first ever figure. Let's see how well this goes. The figure in question is a German NCO deployed in Italy and produced by Alpine Miniatures, who I've been told are a good brand to go to for figures. Let's have a look at the parts. As expected, all the parts included in the kit are beautifully moulded, with crisp details and folds in the jacket and trousers. In some areas there are small amounts of flash or messy areas, though these were super easy to clean up with even my fingernails, leaving no remains behind. Onto the build process. This was a super fast step, as there were only a few parts to fix together. I used gel superglue, as normal modelling cement would have been completely useless on the resin. It's also worth noting how the parts essentially fell into place with little to no effort, leaving no gaps behind. This was truly impressive, as I've never built a kit before that didn't require filler. Painting was initiated with my favourite Mr.Surfacer 1500 primer, thinned to 50% with Mr. Colour Levelling Thinner. This produced a smooth, grease-free surface to hand brush paints effectively onto. The first area that I decided to dive into was the face, along with the exposed arms and hands. These were based with Vallejo model colour brown sand, as it's a nice mid-tone between light and shadow that can then be layered with brighter and darker shades. I brushed this on with a Humroll detail brush, though I soon discovered that this is an awful product and instead turned to my favourite ProArt 4/0 detail brush for further paintwork. Next, I heavily watered down some Vallejo Scarlet to be rushed along all the recessed areas of exposed skin, giving some more life to the figure. This shade was probably a bit bright, and in some areas looked a little like blood or injuries if it didn't clean it up properly. I probably should have added some sort of brown tone to make it a little darker. Finally, for the skin painting process, I added highlights using Vallejo Flat Flesh. These were prominently painted around ridges and other raised areas of the skin, as well as areas where the sun would brighten it up directly, such as the cheekbones or nose. The eyes were quite a challenge to paint on this figure. It wasn't very clear as to where they exactly were, and the helmet's shadow made it quite hard to see them. However, I did end up painting the whites of the eyes along with both pupils and irises. Now onto the trousers. These did seem a little big for our soldier here, bagging up around the bottom, though I just passed this off as a feature of the uniform. They were based with Vallejo German yellow, thinned down with water to avoid particle textures and brush strokes. This means I did have to apply 2 layers of paint to produce a solid colour though. Again, lighter tones were brushed along all the folds and ridges in the fabric, usually at the highest points where the sun would reflect the most. For this, I simply mixed a few drops of white in with the German yellow until it looked about right. Just as a side note, during this painting process I did all of my mixing and thinning on a wet palette, which was a brilliant solution to stop the paint drying too fast. These particular trousers featured many recesses and valleys, so I mixed in some brown with the same German yellow as before, and brushed it in, thinned down massively with tap water as I didn't want to overdo the effect. Also, acrylic paints tend to not blend very well, most of the time leaving nasty tide marks on the surface. Thinning them down massively and then blending as best as possible with more water is the best solution that I've found to this issue. Now for our soldier's jacket. As a base layer for this purpose, I used Vallejo German uniform green, though I really think this turned out to be far too green. Looking at reference pictures, this particular figure's uniform is far more grey in colour, and as such I probably should have added a few drops of neutral grey to the mix to bring down the green tone a little. Again, highlights were added in the same fashion as with the trousers, adding white to the base colour. At this point in time, the highlights seem very strong and a little unnatural, though this is very important as later on I'll be adding some more variation in tone with highlights and a pin wash made from oil paint. This will massively tone down the acrylic highlights, though they are still important and they provide a basic idea of light and shadow on the jacket. Instead of darkening the uniform green with brown to add shadows, I instead used Vallejo camouflage olive green. This really worked in giving some colour variation to the jacket, really emphasising the effect of sun damage along with scrapes and damage to the fabric caused by washing. Now I moved on to some of the smaller details and elements of the figure. This was initiated with the belt, strap and suspenders that a lot of soldiers seem to have during the war. I based them with leather brown, which seems overly dark at this point, though that will be changed soon enough. I once again turned to brown sand for this step. I brushed it carefully where I imagined the leather would stress, exposing cracked areas of lighter material. I applied it very carefully, almost dotting it on to create an imitation gradient as blending was impossible with these acrylic paints. This process was repeated once again, this time with a few drops of white added to the brown sand. The lighter tone was dotted into more focused areas, almost like the chipping process on an armour model. The heads of the stick grenades were based with Vallejo black grey, as black was far too dark in direct comparison with the uniform tones underneath. Highlights were again added by brushing a lighter tone onto the areas that would receive the strongest direct sunlight, such as the flat tops to the grenades. Our guy's MP40 was also based with black grey, though this time I didn't apply highlights and shadows. Instead, I turned to dry brushing it with gunmetal to represent the wear and tear that the gun would almost definitely endure on a daily basis. These, what appear to be ammunition pouches, were painted a light bluish tone along with the water bottle and a big pouch fixed to the back of the soldier's belt. I didn't have a suitable model colour paint for this blue, so instead I used IDF blue model air paint, which was the closest I had. Surprisingly, it went down very nicely in only one layer, so this was a nice surprise. The straps on the ammo pouches were painted leather brown with the same basic highlights as before, painted off camera. There are also some small buttons featured on these straps which were painted by a metal colour aluminium. Well, that's basically the painting done. As I used only acrylic paints on the figure, it was essential to lay down a coat of XF-86 before any oil weathering effects were applied. The white spirit used to dilute and clean them up would destroy the paintwork. The first oil effect that I applied, as I said earlier, was a dark brown pin wash. This really helped to accentuate the recesses and shadowed areas of the figure, even more so than I could achieve with the acrylic paints. A lot of excess would need to be removed though, as it pulled on top of raised details quite frequently. This though isn't a problem with oil paints. They can be easily removed for up to 24 hours after application with white spirit dampened on a brush. Once I started removing the excess, the effect really started to come to life, with amazing contrast between light and dark areas of the figure's jacket and trousers. Following the application of the pin wash, I created some forced shadows with undiluted brown oil paint. I applied a few dots of it with a small brush, all focused in areas that would be darker in colour, such as around the belt. I then used a ProArt soft blender brush to, blend the paint and create a smooth effect. The same idea was repeated with the highlights around the lapel, on the shoulders and on other raised areas of the jacket. I felt like the figure was a bit odd just on its own, so I decided to create a mini display base using an old Tamiya bottle cap. I started by filling the cap with lead shot and then plugging it with DAS air drying clay. This was a very important step as the extra weight was essential in weighing the base down, stopping it from falling over. The extra weight also feels satisfying and it's unexpected when you pick up the base. The same DAS clay was used to add some basic ground texture to the top of the cap, which was essential as otherwise our figure would be standing on top of a plastic moulded Tamiya logo. After his feet were pressed into the ground, I began with some more delicate work. First, I carefully brushed on some wet ground effects from AK, which really helped to add some extra realism and texture to the base. After adding some small stones and static grass tufts, I primed the base with the same Mr.Surfacer as earlier. This was an essential step as it would be difficult to paint up the base with different colours present for each element. The next step was to paint it black. I decided to do this as it not only made it easier to paint the earth tone later on, though any areas that I missed would simply be dark in colour instead of primer grey. The shrubs were painted with both desert yellow and sail colour from Mr. Colour. This dried appearance was essential as this soldier was deployed in Italy where the ground is much more dehydrated than in Central European countries. Flat earth from Tamiya was used as the main earth tone, carefully sprayed around the already painted grass tufts. Overspray wasn't a huge issue though, as a little bit of brown on the grass didn't look bad at all. I then painted a lot of the stones individually with an array of sandy and dirt colour tones. These were hand painted with a brush in order to avoid overspray. As a final ground effect, I wet blended some MIG enamel dry earth effects into the dirt. This ended up looking like some nice imitation dust once dry, so I'd call it a success. Using a lot of white spirit was essential here, as otherwise it would be hard to blend the enamel over the rough surface. Finally, the sides were painted black and I added the figure itself using a couple of dots of gel superglue. And finally, here it is, my first ever figure. As this was my first ever try at painting a figure, I can't really compare it to anything else I've done, though in my personal opinion I don't think it came out half bad. In comparison with work done by professionals though, it lacks massively, and honestly this is to be expected. I'm proud of it though, and I can't wait to get stuck into some more figures and busts in the future. It was a very fun experience. I'm really interested to hear what you think down below, and if you're a more experienced figure painter, I'd love to hear some pro tips and tricks that you've picked up. That's it from me this week. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to drop a like, and if you didn't enjoy, leave a dislike and explain why in the comments. Hope to catch you all here next week. Bye!